Hey guys, let's start with a pro-revenge story by Techno Grind. But I didn't retire. My friend, I'll call her Sandy, worked at a travel agency in British Columbia, Canada. It was a small, owner-operated business with the owner and 3 employees, including my friend. Everyone worked Monday to Friday from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. One of my friend's co-workers, I'll call her Jane, an older woman in her early to mid-60s, was a long-time nuisance employee. Among other sketchy behavior, Jane was always scamming ways to take time off over and above her official paid vacation time. In order to make up for the lost hours, she would claim overtime hours pay by supposedly going into the office in her off hours to finish up work without being requested by the owner to do so. Despite being caught in her own lies on a number of occasions and being warned about trying to claim unsanctioned overtime, the owner of the travel agency was reluctant to officially reprimand Jane or get rid of her. The reason being that the owner discovered after she had hired Jane that Jane had actually been fired from her previous job at another local travel agency for pulling the same stunts. However, Jane had sued her former employer for unfair dismissal and had won a settlement. After a few years of my friend Sandy working at the travel agency, the owner was ready to retire and offered to sell the business to my friend. Sandy took her up on the deal and took over the business while keeping on Jane and the other employee. Once again, just as the previous owner was afraid to get rid of Jane, so was Sandy for fear of being sued. When Sandy took over the business, she instituted guidelines regarding taking time off, and she established an official no overtime policy. Jane would still try with her shenanigans, but was far less successful in getting what she wanted with my friend in charge. However, Jane still had one trick up her sleeve when she wanted to take time off on a whim. Sandy was a divorced single mom of 2 boys who were heavily involved in youth hockey. She would sometimes leave the office an hour or 2 before closing to get her boys to hockey practice or a game. In order to avoid requesting in person and potentially being denied, Jane would wait for Sandy to be out of the office to book a day off if she didn't feel like coming into work or had made plans. Sandy would then arrive at work the next morning only to discover that Jane wasn't coming in. Despite this happening a number of times, Sandy would usually let it slide, since there was now a definite no overtime policy. Therefore, Jane could no longer claim to come in to work on the weekend or after hours. In order to try and make up for the day off, she would either miss out on a day's pay, in turn saving Sandy money as the owner, or it would come out of her remaining paid vacation days. Moreover, 2 people in the office at one time could usually handle everything. Jane not coming in was really a no-loss situation for Sandy. There was one time, however, when Sandy was going to be away for 1 or 2 work days just before the weekend to take her boys to a hockey tournament. She told both Jane and the other employee, both verbally and in writing, that they could not book time off for the dates in question since she would be away and needed both of them in the office. Within a few days of giving this notice, Sandy went into the office on a Saturday to do some paperwork and go through the sales for the week. This is when she discovered that only the day before, Jane had booked a trip for her daughter and son-in-law to Las Vegas, as well as a plane ticket in her name to Calgary, where her daughter lived. Both the trip to Vegas and the ticket to Calgary coincided with the dates Sandy would be out of the office. Sandy then checked the vacation booking schedule to further discover that Jane had indeed booked the days off that she had expressly been told she couldn't have. Not mentioning she had discovered the travel Jane had booked for herself and her daughter, Sandy emailed Jane, telling her she would have to deny her the days off since she had already been told they were unavailable because she, Sandy, would be away and needed Jane in the office. Through a continued series of email exchanges, Jane replied and outright lied to Sandy with some excuse about her daughter getting some long-awaited medical treatment or surgery, and she needed to go to Calgary to help out for a few days and look after her granddaughter. Sandy replied to this lie by telling Jane she knew about the trip she had booked to Vegas for her daughter and son-in-law, that Jane's trip to Calgary was most likely to babysit her granddaughter while her daughter was in Vegas, and that she would still have to deny Jane the days off, especially since she booked them after being told they were unavailable. Jane countered in her subsequent reply without even addressing the fact that she had been caught in a lie. that she had been a dedicated employee of the travel agency for several years and couldn't understand why she was being treated so unfairly after all she had done for the business. She then wrote that since she wasn't being treated as a valued employee, she had no choice but to retire and was giving her 2 weeks' notice. Despite Jane's threat, Sandy replied that she would still be unable to grant her the days off and left it at that, without making any mention of Jane's threat to quit retire. Sandy then contacted her accountant, who also acted as her de facto business advisor, and explained what had happened with Jane. Also aware of Jane's previous shenanigans, Sandy's accountant told her that this was the out she had been looking for with Jane and she had it all in writing. He told her that Jane had essentially resigned, retired, and all Sandy needed to do was honor Jane's desire to do so, let her finish out her 2 weeks or pay her 2 weeks' wages in lieu with no further severance pay legally required since she hadn't been fired. The following Monday, Sandy went into the office early, accompanied by her long-term boyfriend, to act as a witness. She put Jane's belongings from her desk into a box and took the things that were property of the business. Since Jane was old school and had resisted inputting client information in the computer database, this also included a small box filled with index cards that had client phone numbers, addresses, credit card information, and other personal information noted on them. In the meantime, the other employee had arrived for work, and they all waited for Jane to show up. Jane arrived just before 9, acting as though nothing had happened, and greeted everyone with a good morning as she walked through the door. However, she was apparently taken slightly aback when she noticed Sandy's boyfriend seated in the far corner of the office. At this point, Jane was midway to her desk when Sandy informed her that there was no need to go any further and that she had accepted Jane's notification of retirement. She then handed Jane a check, compensating her for the hours she had worked in the current pay period, as well as 2 weeks' wages in lieu of Jane finishing out her final 2 weeks before her retirement. Jane was dumbfounded and went into panic mode. "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire." Sandy responded that indeed, she had retired, given her notice, and had proof of it in writing. All Jane could do was continue repeating, "But I didn't retire. I'm not ready to retire," while unsuccessfully attempting to get the support of the other employee who refused to come to her defense. Sandy then pointed to the box containing Jane's belongings, wished her a happy retirement, and told her to leave the office. Jane quickly rifled through the box and noticed that the small box containing the index cards with client information was not there. She insisted that Sandy return it to her, which Sandy refused to do, explaining that it was property of the business, contained personal client information, and that she would be in violation of Canadian privacy laws if she were to let Jane take it. Jane's shock had now turned to obstinate, and she refused to leave without the box. Both the other employee and Sandy's boyfriend had started to get involved, repeatedly telling Jane to just leave. Sandy then informed Jane that if she didn't leave, they would have to call the RCMP, Canadian Police, at which point Sandy's boyfriend dialed 911 to inform the dispatcher of a disgruntled former employee at XYZ Travel Agency who was refusing to leave the premises. Within a few minutes, 2 police officers arrived, and Jane immediately ran to the door ranting about being fired and about the missing box of client information. In order to de-escalate the situation, one police officer told Jane to come outside and explain to him her side of the story. The other officer remained in the office to hear Sandy's side of the story, agreeing that Jane was not legally entitled to the box of client information. The other officer then entered the business and told Jane to wait outside. He said that Jane was insisting that Sandy was holding onto her personal belongings, namely a box of important information. Both Sandy and the officer who had spoken to her explained the contents of the box to the other officer, who in turn agreed it was not Jane's property. The police officers then picked up the larger box of Jane's personal belongings, took it outside to Jane, and told her she needed to go home. To rub salt in Jane's wounds. The next day, Sandy put up a large sign in the window of the business, congratulating Jane on her retirement, and even put a small announcement in the local newspaper doing the same thing. The icing on the piece of revenge cake was Sandy when filling out the necessary government forms for when an employee quits, gets fired, or retires, made sure to check the box labeled retired for the reason for Jane no longer being employed. By doing so, Jane was ineligible to collect unemployment insurance benefits. Sandy did the right thing by using Jane's own threat of retirement to force her out legally. The public sign and newspaper announcement congratulating Jane on her retirement humiliated her further, and by marking Jane as retired on official paperwork, Sandy ensured she couldn't collect unemployment benefits. Such manipulative employees deserve the same fate. It was truly a satisfying revenge. Let's now move on another revenge story by revolutionary_ant209. My 8-pound revenge on my cheating ex. When I was at university, I started dating this guy. At first, he was wonderful, dedicated to his studies, fun to be around, attentive, and always surprising me with things, working hard at his job, etc. Then, bit by bit, things unraveled. He started skipping classes. Then, he barely bothered to go at all. Worse still, he never helped around the house. Never washed up, cleaned up, did laundry, nothing. He was even fired from his job for too many no-shows. All he wanted to do was sit at home and play Xbox or browse the message boards and forums. This was in the days before social media, when dinosaurs roamed the earth. This left me having to pick up extra shifts, sometimes double and triple shifts, all while going to class and studying. I later learned that this was a pattern for him. He'd be really dedicated to whatever he set his heart on, but then get bored and fall back into old bad habits. Then he'd find a new passion, and rinse and repeat. I knew I should have ended the relationship much sooner, but I held out hope that he would snap out of it, that maybe it was just exam stress getting to him. I desperately wanted things to go back to how they were, but it was not meant to be. I caught him cheating and threw him out. I was so stressed with everything that it wasn't until the next day that our joint savings account crossed my mind. There was a little over $5,000 in there, and bar a few hundred from him, the rest was money I had saved. I checked the account and it was all gone. My ex had cleaned out the account and moved into a new flat with his side chick. I called the bank. There was nothing they could do. He was authorized on the account. I contacted the police. They told me there was nothing they could do since it was a joint account, so nothing criminal had happened. They suggested taking it to civil court, but said I'd probably spend more money than I got back in legal fees, so it likely wasn't worth it. My ex had stolen $5,000 and there was nothing I could do about it. I felt like such an idiot. I got even angrier when I saw his posts on various forums boasting about his new game consoles, new games, new TVs, and gadgets, all bought with my money. I'm not usually a vengeful person, petty on occasion, sure, but I've never wanted to exact revenge as much as I did right then, and I knew just how to do it. While I was a student, I tutored every summer to help pay for my studies. One such job had been for a debt collection agency. The work was as you can imagine, but it paid really well, and it was only for a few months. My ex had been dodging debt for many years, and he was very proud of that fact. He was also proud of the fact that his debt was close to being statute barred, and he hadn't paid a penny. For those of you who don't know, in the UK, creditors have about 6 years to collect a debt, and then it becomes statute barred. That means the money is still owed, but creditors have no legal way to enforce payment, such as using bailiffs. My ex was a few months away from reaching statute barred status. However, what a lot of people don't know is that making a payment on that debt resets the clock. If you pay any amount, then that 6 years starts from scratch. Previously, I had used my insider knowledge to help him dodge the debt. Now, I would use it to hit him where it hurt. By the end of our relationship, I was handling everything, including his debts. I had the paperwork, so I knew who he owed and how much. I called his creditors up. I was honest and said I was a friend calling to make a payment on his behalf. I didn't pretend to be him because that would be a big legal no-no. They weren't allowed to disclose any details, but they were able to take payment. I paid the minimum I could on each debt, about $1 on most, but one had a minimum payment of $150. It was the best $850 I have ever spent. I also made sure to give them his new address and contact details, as well as his parents' address. Having worked in the biz, I knew they wouldn't change the address since I wasn't the account holder, but they would note it. They had various systems where they could search for his name against that address and see if anything came up. If they got a hit, they'd change the address. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait. A few months roll by, then it happened. His posts on the forums went from boasting about his new gaming PC to panic about a court date. He called me and begged for advice. I told him to off. Seeing I wouldn't help, he asked for advice in the forums. One of his online friends told him not to turn up to court. That way they wouldn't be able to prosecute without him there. It was terrible advice that was 100% untrue. In fact, not showing up is one of the worst things you can do, especially in civil court. This was getting better and better. The court date came and went. My ex naturally didn't go. A few weeks later, my ex posted photos of his empty flat. Bailiffs had cleaned him out and taken every last one of his shiny new gadgets and toys. On top of that, he ended up with several CCJs, county court judgments. These are a big deal and can seriously damage your credit history, making it hard to get bank accounts outside of basic ones. Near impossible to get credit, including getting a mortgage, and it can also make it hard to rent a place since many landlords don't like renting to people with CCJs as they're considered high risk. He also won't be able to find jobs in the financial sector. Now that he was broke and didn't have nice things, his side chick left him. I never got my $5,000 back, but it felt good to see everything he bought with his ill-gotten gains taken away. Hope that $5,000 was worth it. For anyone wondering how a student accrued 6 years of debt, he started at the university I attended when he was 25. He had initially gone to a different university at 18 but dropped out at 19 and went into the world of work. Then he convinced his parents to fund a business degree. He wanted to become an entrepreneur. And for anyone worried about the age gap, I deferred my university start date by a few years so I could travel. I was 22 when we started dating. He was 26. Here are some top comments on the post. The first one is from Zoreb1. You learned a lesson too. No joint account unless married. It is too easy to cut and run otherwise, and nothing can be done. This won't stop an account from being cleaned out but can be brought up in divorce proceedings. The next comment is from Juracelian. I clicked this wondering how far a revenge can go with just $8.50, and this totally delivers. Also, I cannot believe he had the gall to ask you for help after he stole thousands from you. After reading so many Reddit posts where the OOP folds after being treated like garbage by their family SOs, your response is gold. Here is another comment. Love this story. An ex of mine did something similar and left me with $5,000 in credit card debt. This was over 15 years ago. I was young and stupid and had given him the secondary card on my account. I'd bought him a really nice bicycle while we were together. After the breakup, he hadn't collected it from my place yet. I gave it away. He threatened to call the cops on me for stealing his bike, but the purchase was on my credit card and the receipt was in my name, so he couldn't do shit. It was petty AF and certainly didn't help me pay off the credit card debt, but it felt good. It was really a clever and precise revenge. It was OP's knowledge of debt collection that enabled her to inflict the huge revenge on her ex-boyfriend, ruining his credit history, making it difficult for him to rent, get credit, and making his new girlfriend break up with him. Let's move on to another an r/pro revenge story by Called in the 90s. How to lose a client. You might think that losing clients doesn't require much skill, but I assure you that it does, at least the way I do it. Normal lawyers lose clients by not answering emails or by grossly overcharging or by f***ing up in court. That's how lazy lawyers or greedy lawyers or incompetent lawyers lose clients. But it takes talent, real God-given talent, to lose clients the way I lose them. Let me tell you about one of those times where I lost a client while saving them $4 million in the process. The client was a small bank, barely big enough to deserve the name, and they had a few branches here and there in and about the city where I practice. Their parent bank was this massive affair overseas, and my client was their Canadian offspring, a tiny attempt on the parent bank's part to dip their toe in Canadian financial waters. They've grown a lot since I helped them out more than 20 years ago, and they're pretty big now. I see their branches all over town. Too bad they have someone else doing their legal work. I'd be rich now if they were still my client. But a man with an MBA put a stop to that. Bank work was not something our firm was known for, but when one of my rainmaking partners managed to land a little bank client, I couldn't say no. I was pretty excited when the first, and in the end, the last bank litigation file hit my desk. I always get excited when a new file hits my desk because there's always a story behind it, and I love stories. The story for this file was wonderful. Down the street from my bank client, there was this weaselly little fraudster who worked in an office of Big Corp Inc. The weasel's job included processing checks payable to Big Corp Inc. One day the weasel walked down the street to my client, the little bank, and he opened an account in the name of Big Corp. Not Big Corp Inc., just Big Corp. He left the Inc. part out. After he opened the account, he put a bit of money into it and left it alone for a few weeks. Then one day he popped into the bank and he was carrying a check payable to his employer, Big Corp Inc. It was only for a few $100, but seeing as the weasel was about to commit fraud, he was starting out small. He deposited the check to the account he set up in the name of Big Corp, using an ATM, and after the usual hold, it cleared, and suddenly the weasel was richer by a few $100s. No one noticed the little fraud at Big Corp Inc. Maybe because the weasel worked in accounts receivable or accounting or bean counting. And so maybe the weasel was able to fiddle with the books a bit to cover things up. So a couple of weeks later, the weasel did it again. For more money this time. And then again. And again. And soon, it was a regular thing. Pretty well every day, the weasel would drop by the bank and deposit a check payable to Big Corp Inc. into the account he opened in the name of Big Corp without the Inc., and the checks kept clearing. Big Corp Inc. was getting ripped off, but someone was asleep at the switch, and no one noticed that there was a hole in their receivables. Eventually, the weasel's little crime spree came to an end, and there was less than $50K in the account when Big Corp Inc. woke up and started to ask questions. But the weasel took off, and so Big Corp Inc. looked at my little bank client and said, "You owe me $4 million because that's how much the weasel stole from them." All this I figured out pretty quickly from reviewing the file and the checks and the statements and the records. But the tough part was figuring out the law. After I sorted the facts out, I read the statement of claim again. It had made no sense to me when I read it the first time, but once I had the facts figured out, I read the claim a second time, and I could see that it was badly drafted. It complained and kvetched, but it didn't state a cause of action, and my first thought was that Big Corp Inc. didn't have a case. Not the bank's fault that Big Corp Inc. has a fraudster working for them, I thought, because my bank client didn't profit from the fraud. The bank didn't steal the money. But I did my legal research, and after a while I discovered that Big Corp Inc. had a great case. Their cause of action was for the tort of conversion, and it took me a while to wrap my head around that. But conversion it was, and Big Corp Inc.'s case was rock solid. Even worse, my bank had no right to cross-claim or counterclaim or blame anyone. My client had no defense, as in zero. My client was a sitting duck. Our case was so bad, so dreadful, that I didn't even know how to plead to it. I had no idea what I'd put in a statement of defense. I went home and slept on it, and when I came into the office the next morning, I had a bit of a plan. I wrote an email to plaintiff's counsel explaining to him that his client's case sucked, that there was no cause of action. I said that if he made me file a defense, that I'd bring a motion to strike out the claim and would seek costs. Plaintiff's counsel, remember, is the guy who didn't know he had a great case, hadn't done his research, and hadn't figured out this tort of conversion thing. In other words, he was weak. So me with the case did all the threatening, while the lawyer with the slam dunk hemmed and hawed and delayed. He gave me a waiver of defense, which I graciously accepted, while continuing to threaten that if he didn't drop the case soon, maybe I would file a defense and then bring that motion to strike. I didn't think I'd actually get away with it, but when your case sucks and when opposing counsel is a bit weak, then bluffing is an okay strategy. The bluff was working very well, and I had the sense that plaintiff's counsel was close to running up a white flag. But then my client hired a new guy. Right from the start, I didn't like the new guy. He was typical of his kind, a guy who used the latest business buzzwords that he'd learned while doing an MBA, the kind of guy who talks about synergy and good Q1 results. "I'm worried about this lawsuit," MBA man said to me. "You should be. If you go to court, you're going to lose." I'd made that clear enough in my emails. The bank had no defense. All we could do was bluff. "You don't sound very worried about it. It's too soon to start worrying," I said. "Just give it time, and let's see if the bluff thing works out." But MBA man had other ideas. He was barely 30, but he had his degree in his buzzwords, and a few days later, I got an email from him that read something like this: "We must leverage an integrated risk management framework to optimize litigation allocation, ensuring that large-scale lawsuits are channeled towards prominent firms, while smaller litigation matters are redirected to more boutique entities." Basically, what he was saying was that the file was too big for me. He was going to hire a big firm, and maybe I could sit at the kiddie table and do their small claims court. Not long after that, MBA man confirmed that he'd be hiring another firm, and while he was looking, he wanted me to stay out of trouble, to soft pedal the file. At least, that's what I think he meant, but what he actually wrote was something like, "Given the urgent need for strategic resource optimization, I would recommend a temporary cessation of engagement on this particular file and the suspension of any interlayer communications until a suitable replacement is identified." But of course I ignored him because I could tell I was close to finishing things off. I continued to badger and bluff, and before long, I had a discontinuance in my file, bringing the action to an end. The bluff had worked, and Big Corp Inc. decided it would sue someone else, or maybe they had insurance. I don't know, but their claim against my little bank client was done because I'd strangled it before it ever got going. Their lawyer sent me a discontinuance, and that's all I needed. I didn't give a shit about a release or a dismissal or any of the usual bells and whistles that normally mark the final end to a file. My case was all bluff, and the less work I asked of opposing counsel, the better. After all, if I demanded he do things or sign things, he might delegate to someone else in the office, someone who had a brain, and if that happened, the jig was up. "How much do you hope to settle this for?" I said to MBA man in one of the emails I sent him, and he replied that he thought that he might be able to get it done at $2 million because lawsuits were a 50-50 proposition, so it made sense to settle for half of the loss. He was a real genius, MBA man. If I had interpersonal skills, if I could schmooze, I probably could have sorted things out and kept the client. But I have no such skills. My talent, as I mentioned at the start of this little tale, is for losing clients. And so instead of calling up MBA man and explaining my strategy in monosyllables while praising him for his genius and inviting him out to play golf, I instead replied to his email with the good news that the bank wouldn't have to pay anything. The action was discontinued, and while technically the plaintiff could sue again, all the bank had to do was sit tight and wait for the limitation period to expire on the last of the checks. I didn't hear from MBA man for a few days. My guess is he hired someone from a big firm, because when he finally emailed me back, he had some legal words in his vocabulary. Why had I not obtained a release, or at least a dismissal with prejudice? Where were the minutes of settlement? How could I be so careless with the bank's money and reputation? And that was it. That's how it went down. I saved the bank $4 million, but I was entered in the bank's books as the careless lawyer that was to be avoided at all costs. The bank paid my bill at least, although they were a bit slow, and when I told my partners what happened, they just shook their heads. I recently checked out MBA man on LinkedIn to see how he and his buzzwords were doing. He left the little bank years ago to talk business speak in some other company, and he stuck it out for close to 2 decades, but recently, he started a new career as a consultant. Maybe he always wanted to own his own business, But what's more likely is that it was a regrettable case of age-related misalignment, resulting in an involuntary workforce reduction, underpinned by the pursuit of an optimal productivity paradigm. As for me, I'm still here, and I will always hate dealing with MBAs. The revenge was subtle, yet perfect. The lawyer proved himself a hero for the company by saving $4 million. Despite the dismissive attitude and business jargon of the MBA man, the lawyer sailed through the legal battle successfully.